Hello, welcome again to Sport or Not, going through all the week's sports news. Coming up, a very special guest, the FIFA Vice President, CONCACAF President, Victor Montagliani. But so much of the global sporting agenda has been dominated by the fallout and response to tragic events in the world. There was the massacre launched from Gaza on Israel and the escalation of the Israel-Hamas war. There were also the deaths of 2 Sweden fans in Brussels who were shot dead in what's been called a terror attack ahead of the Belgium-Sweden men's Euros qualifier. Joining me, Rob Harris from Sky News as ever, Tariq Panja from the New York Times and Martyn Ziegler from the Times. And has certainly been a couple of weeks where the geopolitics and security of the world has meshed into how sports is reported.
Yeah, I mean, there are some obviously immediate consequences for football, aren't there? I mean, the UEFA have basically left the Sweden-Belgium match at a 1-1 draw after it was abandoned at half-time. Israel matches have been disturbed after the Hamas attacks, and the Palestine national team looks like their matches are going to be affected. So there are the direct football things, but this has kind of spilled over, hasn't it, into not just the effects on football, but a sort of broader debate. Even some might even say culture war about how football should react.
Utterly horrific week. And you say, obviously this pod is about sports and sports news, and the ramifications obviously much bigger. But yeah, the issues that we've seen, Rob, have been very specific to football. And in the UK, over the last week where we're based, it's been a really difficult week in terms of, I guess, tone in many ways as well, right?
And obviously football having to grapple with very complex issues, particularly with Israel-Hamas. It does link to a decades-old conflict and long-standing enmities, but sparked in this instance by the horrific Hamas attacks, the murder, the rape, the torture, kidnapping of those in Israel, 1,400 people killed. Then a whole discussion over what is a proportional response from Israel to, as they would see it, protect their security, which leads to then civilian deaths in Gaza as well. Obviously, this is now an ongoing situation. In sporting terms, we know of former footballers, basketball players who've been killed on the Israeli side. Less detail from the Palestinian side, which does immediately give a sporting issue about how sport does respond. And for a period, there was the silence, obviously. We didn't hear from UEFA and FIFA for a week in particular after the Hamas attacks, the Premier League silent on the weekend after it. And I suppose we look at it from an English perspective in particular, because there's a lot of mourning at matches for various instances around the world. And in particular, this singular focus on the Wembley Arch, which might have been heard about. And it has been lit in the last few years after attacks in various countries, lit up with the Turkish flag, the French flag, the Belgian flag after attacks there, and with the Ukrainian flag after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which somehow became this sort of national symbol of sort of solidarity with these countries, but perhaps set themselves up for more complex situations.
Yeah, I mean, they found themselves in a situation where they FA wanted to reflect a sort of pay tribute to all victims, so innocent victims in Israel and innocent victims in Palestine, and then it's how do you do that? And basically, I think their previous record of writing up the arch got themselves into trouble, and not surprisingly, I think they've now taken the decision that for the future they're going to light up the arch far less often than they have done in the past, and probably be much more football related. For example, like when Pele died and they used it to mark that. I think this sort of using it for social or quasi-political or anything else, I think that's going to be a thing of the past from now on.
The level of polarization as well, especially with social media being what it is today, and the search for immediate comments on all these sides, it causes, has caused, certainly this past week, a real mess in terms of the response, the tone of the response, language from various bodies, whether they're sporting bodies, public bodies, the media. This is almost a moment for reflection here. Shame it's taken the horrors of what we saw 2 weeks ago with that Hamas terrorist attack, and then now these civilian deaths in the I guess almost north of 1,000 and more probably by the time people are listening to this.
And what probably brought this into sharper focus was what happened in February 2022 after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Premier League themselves adopted the Ukrainian flag with football stands together at matches. They even announced in their statement that their display of solidarity would be linked to those by the UK government. So that was very much aligning themselves with this cause. And I can't remember if I said it on the podcast at the time. I was certainly asking around football at the time, well, what would happen with a more complex situation? At the time, we were talking quite a bit about China and Taiwan. What would happen with the Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Would the Premier League adopt the Taiwanese flag? And it made me question why football, when adopting these moments that seem unifying at the time, don't think of the sort of the worst case scenario, the most difficult scenario to maintain consistency down the line.
Short term and opportunistic, I guess, when you're pushing at an open door, Rob. And the questions you would have asked at the time are perfectly valid, and here we are today. The Ukraine and Russia war, I think that's a classic example. It was so binary, and they saw it as a very, very easy, sorry to use a sporting analogy, easy win here. And now look what's happened.
I actually think it goes back even further to this sort of decision to get involved with the whole, Premier League and English clubs wearing poppies on the shirts, and a big fight with FIFA to be allowed to do so. I mean, what was the point of that? That was just, I think, responding to pressure from certain sections of the media. But just don't get involved in things like that, I think, in the first place. And that almost, in a way, set English football down a particular road.
I'm not going to name the media organisations, but the idea of being terrified of a couple of newspaper front pages, it just shows a lack of strength and conviction of the leaders. Why get so sort of frazzled by a couple of attention-seeking headlines in a way? Just have a strategy. These organisations are supposed to be people by smart, serious people who know what they're doing. And to blow in the wind with every kind of screaming headline, it sets you down a road that ends up in a situation we're in today.
Yes, and we saw that with FIFA and UEFA as well. So UEFA said absolutely nothing in the immediate week after the attacks. Neither did FIFA. We did see letters that both Alexander Sheffrin and Gianni Infantino sent to the FAs in both Israel and Palestinian territories too, and they did offer condolences, but they were very caveated and cautious in their regard. And probably with FIFA, there's more of a spotlight, although Sheffrin had been to Israel a few weeks earlier because he'd been to meet both the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the President Herzog, as well as the FA. Gianni Infantino, and I'm sure we've questioned it on here before, went to the White House in 2020 to the signing ceremony of the Abraham Accords. Was it the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel? And there were questions at the time. Why was he at such quite a political event? What was football's role to do that? What was his necessity to go there in the midst of the pandemic?
Infantino at the time, let's look into the context of that. He had developed a very, very close relationship with the Donald Trump White House, particularly Jared Kushner, who was at the center of this. Infantino seemed to like being around the orbit of these people, and at the time, with the UAE and Gulf leadership, it kind of fitted into his almost lifestyle and in this profile, to the point where he was at this quite significant, very significant signing of the Abraham Accords, this peace accord, if you want, a recognition for the first time of Israel by the United Arab Emirates, and a huge deal, and a couple of other countries. But it wasn't a football event. He didn't need to be there, but he made sure that we knew he was there. Now, Rob, let me ask you, in terms of Infantino, that was all known, well known and well publicized. When it's sensitive, where does he tend to put these statements out? Is it as well known? Is it as well publicized?
Well, the only reason we actually saw his letter to the Israeli FA is because I got sent it from there. That was the first word after contacting FIFA media every day, all week, to ask what their position was. And they just had nothing. And eventually I got the letter and just posted it. Then a few hours later, he posted on his Instagram, Gianni Infantino, a couple of very tiny versions of his letter to the Israeli and Palestinian FAs, which you couldn't barely read. And it was posted on Instagram stories, which for those less familiar, disappear after 24 hours. So they weren't sent out on a press release. They weren't put on the FIFA media Twitter or X account. They weren't put on the main FIFA account. They weren't put on the FIFA website, which you'd think this is pretty notable to post there, particularly as not just for media, other football associations around the world might want to take some sort of guidance and know what the FIFA leadership position is. Perhaps they might follow, or they might take a sort of different path from that. I mean, what Infantino actually wrote was football could play a small part in potentially delivering peace. So he was putting football as having a role in somehow ending this very long-running, bitter conflict and enmities.
Writing a letter to the Israeli FA is the right way to go, but I don't quite understand why that's not sort of released publicly. But this thing about football being involved in delivering peace. I mean, Sepp Blatter, you probably remember this. This was his sort of grand idea that he was going to bring peace to the Middle East and he was going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, and he spoke about it quite often, didn't he? But I mean, his efforts, which from the moment he became president in 1998, he brought Palestine into FIFA then, and he, is one of his recurring themes, but it was a complete failure.
It was Kjetil Sim, a Norwegian football executive, who brought Blatter the Nobel Committee, no less, into FIFA House with the now short-lived Handshake for Peace, sponsored by the people who give out the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately for Blatter, the major scandal that took out him and most of the FIFA leadership at the time ended those hopes.
Bringing it back to the current situation, so Infantino's letter referenced his call for an immediate end to hostilities and relief to end the suffering of both the people from Israel and Palestine. Again, we had the Premier League and FA statements sort of providing what some saw as an equivalence when, on the Israeli side, certainly it was the worst attack a single day against Jewish people since the Holocaust. Then, obviously, Palestinian deaths too, but very complex situation with the fact Gaza being run by the Hamas administration, which countries like the UK and the US do see as a terror group. So you can understand why it is very complex to wade into this. As far as I could gather, the Romanian FA were one of the only football associations, certainly the only statement I saw that particularly said their silence was to mark the acts of terrorism against Israel, whereas generally all round it was a sort of joint position of the victims from Israel and Gaza as well.
It's not only the FAs, the players too have found themselves in awkward positions and in difficult positions and in controversial positions. We've seen players being suspended by their teams for pro-Palestinian messages, some that you could say are crossing the line as far as the FA are concerned. You have some examples of those. And then there was also a comment, a very incendiary comment from the French Interior Minister Darmanin this week about Karim Benzema, who's currently playing in Saudi Arabia, saying that, paraphrase him a bit, that everyone knows that Benzema is a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is a proscribed organization in Saudi Arabia where Karim Benzema is currently playing. So I didn't see any justification or backing for those comments.
So those players who were suspended, Youssef Attal at Nice, allegedly for sharing a video from a Palestinian preacher about a dark day for Jewish people, which was seen as anti-Semitic. And at Mainz, they suspended Anwar El Ghazi for comments that they deemed unacceptable. He did share comments that included the phrase "from the river to the sea," which is viewed, particularly by the UK government, as anti-Semitic and about the destruction of Israel. So those particular cases, and there've obviously been more Palestinian statements, pro-Palestinian statements that haven't had any action. So perhaps some seen it as a clamp down on supporting the Palestinian cause, but it seems that these are very specific cases. And we've seen many players just sharing the Palestinian flag in various messages of sort of solidarity. Also, the only Israeli player in the Premier League, Manor Solomon at Tottenham, he's been posting quite strident messages. against Hamas and in support of his country.
Kind of struck me that if you think back a year about in Qatar, the World Cup, there were really sort of open demonstrations pro-Palestinian support. So I suppose some of the players who might have been involved in theirs, they think that they're looking back over what's happened over decades, and but the immediate feeling that lots of people feel is the revulsion at what happened over this sort of horrific attack on that Saturday. So it's just one of these things which polarizes people, and football has been stuck in the middle.
Yeah, particularly then when we had that attack on the Sweden fans in Brussels ahead of the European Championship qualifier. So then football was wondering, how does it mark those deaths, having spent the week in such a complex situation with Israel-Hamas? And we eventually did get a UEFA statement which said that they would be marking the deaths, and what they said in their statement was that it would be in memory of the two victims of yesterday's terror attack in Brussels. They then put a later statement out a few hours later saying that they would have a moment of silence at games in memory of all members of the European football family killed in recent days in Europe and Israel. I know certainly the English Football Association, that raised alarm bells because, of course, Israel is in European football terms, which then led at England's game against Italy to then put in their own message on the big screen, changing it to make clear that it was in memory of all members of the European football family killed in recent days from UEFA member nations, Israel and Sweden. And they put the UEFA logos on that message. So certainly that shows the complexity. And this all came when UEFA had just been dealing with the Russia situation. So in the previous pod, we talked about how UEFA decided to readmit some Russian teams, the under-17s teams, ending the blanket ban in place since the start of the Ukraine war. We mentioned about the backlash with certainly the English FA, some of the Baltic FAs, Swedish FA, and the like, all protesting against UEFA's decision to readmit Russian teams. And then UEFA performed a U-turn.
I think when we talked about it before, we did question how they were going to actually technically get them into the draws. If nobody was going to play, they weren't going to be able to go to Sweden. So you could say it was probably quite predictable, but nevertheless embarrassing for UEFA to have to do that U-turn.
Not just embarrassing; it's cost the guy from Sweden, Karl-Erik Nielsen, his role at the top of Swedish sport, hasn't it? He was forced to resign after being the first speaker after Sheffield in that UEFA board meeting to back this plan
over his contradictory views, given his position as chair of the Swedish Sports Coalition,
who wouldn't allow them to be there, and it's hugely embarrassing, and it's a complete own goal, and they haven't actually got these games played. Why was this introduced? What a blunder!
Yeah, it was a mistake. I blame Rob Harris for Karl-Erik Nielsen's resignation, because he was the person who pointed out publicly the fact he'd voted in opposition to his National Association's position.
We take the broader view, perhaps you can either look at this as democracy in action in UEFA. They proposed something, they voted on something, there was a backlash, boycott calls, and UEFA had to reconsider it, and they reversed the decision. Or it shows they should have consulted more widely first to actually get a real sense of the situation, and it would point to the fact by dropping it on this meeting, it took too many people by surprise who were opposed and weren't going to move their position.
Karl-Erik, not the only FA president in trouble over this. Jesper Muller, his close friend and Danish FA president, who also seemed to give this his backing in the board, was forced to appear on live Danish television, I think, to kind of apologise for this and to make the position clear.
Well, that Russia decision, all about leadership, how much you consult and how you land a decision. A lot of football focus at the start of the pod, but certainly the International Olympic Committee has been meeting in the last week in Mumbai. Gianni Infantino amongst the IOC members there, but it's all been about the person at the top, Thomas Bach. And now this perhaps doesn't get as much global attention. It's not the talk of sports fans. There's not as much familiarity perhaps with Thomas Bach, but a really consequential moment did happen there. So Thomas Bach's term is due to end as IOC president in 2025, but is he trying to stay on?
Well, he would probably claim he's not, but several IOC members stepped up and urged him to despite to change effectively would require the IOC to change its statutes to allow him to stay on for another 4 years. Interestingly, Inside the Game has found a good video of Thomas Bach talking in 2015 about FIFA and urging them to bring in term limits, as the IOC had done in 2001. So it would be, you'd say, slightly hypocritical if he bowed to pressure from the members and stayed on for another 4 years.
Yeah, he was shocked when those members from the floor stunned him by saying that maybe they should study him staying on beyond the mandate. And just for a second, let's think about why that mandate was brought in. It was brought in I think in the late 90s after the Salt Lake City bribery scandal. It was one of the measures that was brought in to prevent leaders from staying so long. Thus creating cronyism, bad governance, and risk of corruption. And here we are backsliding. And it's not just Thomas Bach. We've seen this at FIFA. Gianni Infantino will probably stay on. There's a mechanism for him to stay on beyond the term limits at FIFA, and same at UEFA as well. Should Alexander Shevrin want to stay on beyond his term limits? The point of these term limits are really important. It is to bring new blood in, to stop a kind of an ossification, to stop people just staying in place, and that power really residing at the top of these organizations. And you know what happens when it does.
Power too hard to give up. And also, how many members would openly oppose you staying on when so much of their power and committee roles obviously depend on loyalty to the top?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to unseat an incumbent, isn't it? So that's one of the issues. But it was noticeable that one of the people who urged Thomas Bach to stay on was Luis Oviedo from the Dominican Republic, who just coincidentally was he was allowed to stay on until the end of 2027 as IOC member, despite the fact that he is going to be over the age limit of 70 at the end of this year. So maybe he was speaking out in the hope that he would get some favourable treatment in terms of his own extension application, which he did.
Cronyism. That's the risk. So you can't have these embedded relationships. It's just a huge risk. Good luck to all those people. I'm sure everyone's very ambitious, but the rules are there for a reason. And just my last point on this. The thing is, they can do whatever they want. That's what we have to be clear about. There is nothing above these organizations, right? There's nothing above FIFA, nothing above the IOC to force them to, stick to their statutes. Because whenever a problem arises, let's just look at our statutes and make a change, and then we move on. There is no outside oversight of any of these bodies. They're a law unto themselves.
Matters of good governance. Well, who better to discuss some of these issues with about how particularly football is run than someone who's on the inside, who's on the FIFA Council, is one of the FIFA vice presidents, so he's on the FIFA Bureau. We've had the chance at the Leaders in Sport conference this week to sit down with Victor Montagliani, the CONCACAF President and FIFA Vice President. Welcome back.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here. Great to be in London this week for Leaders, and great to see you guys.
So much has happened since, when was it? March 2022, we spoke to you. That was ahead of the 2022 Qatar World Cup. Now all roads lead to, it's going to be Saudi 2034, isn't it?
Well, how about our World Cup in 26? Wow, you've already aged me, mate. Obviously there's a process there, and obviously they have launched their intention. I don't know about formally launched it, because there's a process there too from a paperwork standpoint, but they've launched their intention. The Asian Confederation has backed their bid, as we all know, and let's see what the days to come or weeks to come reveals.
What is the sort of justification or the reason for running this bid process so early? Because I mean, the only comparable one I can think of is when they did the 2022 one for Qatar back in 2009. It seems very, very early.
Well, actually, we did it ourselves for 2026. So the process was supposed to be, and I don't know the exact dates, but we, as Canada and US mainly, with my colleague at the time, Mr. Gulati, we pushed FIFA to expedite the process because we were ready to go. The FIFA Council saw no merits in not doing it, and so we pushed it up a year early to have it voted on in Russia in 2018. This is no different than what we did, but nobody actually said anything when we did it. So thank you very much for not asking me those questions in 2017. But I see this no different in terms of obviously 2030 was decided, as we know, and that and I think with the size now going through what we're going through for 26, the sheer size of this thing now, the more time you have, the way better time you have.
For people who don't know how this works, which is most people in the world outside of your orbit, what struck me is the Saudis were within minutes ready with an announcement from the Crown Prince, then the FA, and you mentioned they got the support of the AFC. That came within an hour of this idea that the 2034 were almost like everybody knew what was going to happen. How comes that was the case?
Well, you would have to ask them that question, but obviously, there obviously were regardless of when the announcement was coming, obviously they were ready to bid long before, even before that happened. I think they were very clear. They were in it for 2030. And, they were also made it clear to anybody they spoke to that they were in it not only for 2030, they were in it for 34 if they didn't win 2030. So they're very clear that this is a very important project for them. And so I think they were ready to hit that button anytime they needed to.
The other button they seem to have hit is like we're less than 2 weeks since that announcement was made, and they have announced that they already have signed up 101 of FIFA's 211 members to back them. That's incredibly quick. How do you get that much backing so fast for a World Cup bid? There's not even a process yet.
Yeah, obviously you have, you have Asia that has 47 members, Africa that has whatever that is. And so I don't think it's that hard to get to that number if you have people that believe in your project.
I suppose something we talk about a lot on the pod, probably focusing a lot in FIFA, is the decision making, and perhaps it can be viewed then as cynical when these deals seem to emerge. It's not the Congress deciding one day on a press release decisions effectively made on 2030 and 2034. Is there still a challenge how these decisions are made and how the wider world might see them?
I think it's a great question. I think the question should be, is even this process the right process? I think giving the ultimate decision making to 211 countries who really are not they're obviously vested in the World Cup, but the whole process and the details that goes along with a bidding process, I think we need to really look at that. I understand what happened in the past and embedding it in at the time was an executive committee. But, in the corporate world, shareholders don't get asked to vote on those things. It's the board, and the board is voted in by the shareholders. I think we really need to look at it. The FIFA Men's World Cup is 95% of the revenue generated by FIFA, right? It's the biggest asset that pays all the FIFA forward money to all the countries. The fact that, for instance, the FIFA General Secretary and the FIFA President doesn't have a vote, that would never happen in any corporate environment where the CEO and the chairman of an organization has absolutely nothing to say about your biggest financial asset. I think if we're really going to look at proper governance, you kind of might want to take a page from the corporate world and see maybe, is there a better, more efficient way? Is there a better strategic way to do it? Because, having obviously you have to do your due diligence. It has to be very transparent, regardless who votes, whether it's a body of 211, or it's a body of 37. That always has to be transparent. But your due diligence has to be done. You have to take into account what your staff that does your due diligence says, and also strategically maybe taking a more long-term view, right? Because again, it's a big asset. It should be done properly. It needs to be spread geographically. There's different reasons to have the World Cup. Obviously, finances is a big reason, but also from a development standpoint and how you wick that in. Maybe you do it from a shared perspective, like we've seen that's going to be happening in the future here. So I think it's an appropriate time to relook at how we do it. because this thing that I think the bid process in itself. I mean, we spent a lot of money in our bid process. Should that really happen? Should MAs be spending that kind of money in the bid process, or should it be done more at a level that is, I think, at a better corporate level than how it is now? Those are just, I think, serious questions that I think have to address moving forward.
Because it's now 2023, we don't know where the Women's World Cup host is going to be in 2027. Would actually it be better for FIFA to have a long-term plan? It's not just where's that World Cup going to be about, how do we get to things like equal pay? And it's in part, how can we make money out of the tournament? And where will it be?
100%. I think the Women's World Cup would really, benefit from that strategic long-term planning and not being behind the eight ball. And as you know, 24 will vote for 27 and 25 will be 31. So it's catching up, because before it was even tighter, as we saw with Paris and as we saw with Australia. So I think, again, those same questions need to be asked. Is there a better way to handle your number one asset from a revenue standpoint, but also is there a better way from a strategic and a corporate governance standpoint?
It's 2.5 years until the 2026 World Cup starts or thereabouts, but we still don't know where the final is. Is it right that you're getting so close to the tournament and that a decision hasn't been made where the main event is going to be?
It's 2 years, 8 months, and 21 days, if you want to be exact. But who's counting? No, listen, I think first and foremost, I mean, from a readiness standpoint, I don't think we need to really worry, although there's always work to be done in terms of our venues and our stadium. It's not like we're building any stadiums here, right? We got to build a stadium for a final. So, the process is going along, and our goal is to have that decision this year. Once they're announced, we'll be off to the races.
Just back onto this, you mentioned FIFA, 95% of its revenue, more or less, like a large amount of it. Not to put you on the spot with your 95% number, man. It's from the World Cup, so it's its biggest thing. It stops the world for an entire month. We all love it. Now, 2 weeks ago, a decision was made not for one World Cup, but 2030, with this 3 continents, with games in South America, in Europe, and Africa with Morocco, and then this 2034 seismic decisions. We talked about it when we last spoke to each other, the three of us. There's not been a press conference or any chance for the public to have a conversation about it. The media, it was just a press release. Something that big?
I wasn't unaware there wasn't a press conference because, obviously, I think our council meeting was on Zoom, I believe. So, listen, obviously, I'm here to answer any of your questions, and I'm sure, if you're going to pose the same questions at FIFA, I don't think they've ever shied away from answering questions. So, from what I'm aware of, I think, listen, the reality of 34 is that, I know everybody, they've come out of the gate, whatever, but from a process standpoint, it's still not final, in terms of even just going past the first post. It's not finalized till October 31st, I believe.
Yeah, but we also have 2030, which is enormous. Like across these 3 continents, questions about how it's going to be done logistically, the environmental impact, all of it. We've not had a chance to talk to anyone about it.
Not sure there's answers in a lot of those, because I think that's a lot of the hard work that needs to be done. The decision has been made in terms of, and by the way, the decision has been made where they are the only bidder. They haven't gotten the World Cup. Not you're saying, come on, they're going to get it. Yeah, you're probably right, but they haven't been awarded. So Portugal, Spain, and Morocco, and the 3 games in South America have not been awarded the World Cup. What has been done is the decision was that this would be the only bid for 2030, and that they would have to meet the standards that are required to put on the World Cup. And if, quite frankly, they don't meet the standards, obviously we have a situation. Now, do I think they're going to meet the standards? Yeah, I do. I don't think they won't, because you're talking about, I think Morocco will put a great foot forward. Spain and Portugal goes without saying. And having 3 games in those countries that, is a football. Those are footballing nations. I don't foresee them not doing it. But I think from a process standpoint, nobody's been awarded 2030, and nobody's been even officially announced from a process standpoint who the candidatures were. Now, FIFA was clear that only Oceania and Asia can bid for 34. Fine. So that limits in terms of where the bids are coming from.
I think you approve of the sort of IOC approach to where they basically the executives select a preferred candidate for a tournament for the Olympic Games. Is that what you're basically saying? You think that it should be a sort of executive decision, because that's effectively what it feels like now, is that there's only one bid being accepted for 2030, and it looks like there's only going to be one bid for 2034. Because there was a big thing about the sort of letting the whole FIFA Congress vote in it, and I guess they have to approve the 2030 bid as well. But is that what you're saying? You think that it should be sort of no more bidding races basically?
Yeah, I think not so much races per se, but not the way we've done it. I mean, I went through it. I experienced it for the 2026 World Cup. It's not fun, right? And it leads to like unnecessary expenditures. I think what we need to do is really rigorously look at the process, make it a lot more corporate with the right due diligence. And by the way, even though it's an executive decision in a smaller body for like the FIFA Council, no different than it is at the Congress, it needs to be transparent. Like it can't just be, yeah, we're picking so and so. It needs to be completely transparent. Why you're doing it, who did it, and ensuring that the standards have been met from a due diligence perspective. Because an asset as big as the FIFA Men's World Cup, and quite frankly, what the Women's World Cup is now, which is a massive asset as well and growing, requires, I think, proper procedures, proper governance, and ensuring that it goes in the proper locations. And taking a long-term view on that, I think, is important. Now, I think we're a bit different than the IOC in that, I think the IOC might be a little bit more challenged in finding hosts because of the sheer nature of the, how many events are going to go into the Olympics. Whereas with us, it's only one sport. We don't need to build infrastructure per se like they have to. You might have to build a stadium, but that's it. You're not building, pools and whatever else, right? So I think we're different in that way. But I think in terms of the principle of a long-term approach, I think it's something we really need to look at.
We started the pod talking about a lot of the geopolitical issues that FIFA is having to confront and contend with. So we've had the Israel-Palestinian situation. How do you honour that? We've had the return of Russia initially from FIFA, and also UEFA, who've U-turned on their decision. Focusing on Russia, first of all, how's that decision reached, and how problematic is it in terms of where Russia sits in football with this war with Ukraine going on so long, and how long they're out for?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, sports and politics is always an uncomfortable mix. I think, and this is no different in terms of these are complicated situations. Obviously, UEFA took a decision, brought it to the FIFA Council, which took a decision, and then had to, obviously, from what my understanding is, they're not going forward with it because once they've started looking at it really more deeply, that it was going to be problematic, and I respect that. It's great to say that we don't want any politics in sports. A little harder to do, I think, and unfortunately, being the global sport that we are, a lot of times, maybe unfairly at times, or always look to solve situations or be a bigger impact that I think we are. But it's the reality of our sport. And, you guys know that because you cover the sport, so you know the global nature of it.
And we did have Gianni Infantino writing to them in the media saying football could play a role in helping to solve the conflict. So through FIFA, he sort of inserts FIFA's role into that. But then how do you avoid taking sides? Sometimes you do take sides, like with Ukraine, where it was very much firmly speaking out against Russia in favour of Ukraine, but then more nuanced when it's Israel who's been attacked by Hamas, but then Israel has obviously attacked back in terms of defending itself, and then civilians are lost on both sides in attacks.
Yeah, obviously, we can play a role. We're not going to be the peacekeepers. Obviously, we have the entire international community, heads of state flying into the region, speaking about Israel, actually Ukraine as well, in terms of trying to bring peace to those areas. Obviously it's not just an unfortunate situation, it's a ghastly situation with in the end, the humanity is suffering here, regardless of what side of the ledger that you may take. But the human loss is shocking, and I think if football can even play a minute role in gravitating some sort of people that come together, great. But the reality is it's a lot more complicated than what football is.
Bringing us back to the World Cup, I'm just really interested in this tournament because it is just so enormous and popular. Now, about more than a third of the planet lives to the east of Qatar, the last host of the World Cup. That's a vast swath of Asia and then Oceania as well. How can it be that the next World Cup in Asia, and you guys have deemed it the sensible spot, is actually a neighboring country to Qatar? It's almost culturally very, very similar. If FIFA's aim is to grow the game, why would you pretty much host the next World Cup in exactly the same place, almost, as the last one?
The next Men's World Cup in Asia, that is 2034 after 2022.
Obviously, we'll see when the bids come forward here at the end of the month. And if it is only one bid that's come forward, then that bid needs to meet the standards, and that's what you're going to go with. I think the region you're talking about will be an interesting area to host anything, because you're right. I mean, from a population standpoint, listen, I'm not sure that is always the measurement, or else we would hope that India and China would co-bid one day.
It's exactly, almost Qatar and Saudi Arabia. It's an envelope, isn't it?
Some people could say that about Western European nations who get the tournament in close succession.
I would say there is a big difference between Spain and Germany, say, and Italy and the United Kingdom. And if you're listening, you can write in to the usual places. But the idea that Qatar and Saudi Arabia are massively culturally different, I would argue. That's what I'm surprised by, that would be the choice for FIFA, that we've had it in Qatar in Asia, and the next one is the neighbor Saudi Arabia.
But if that's the choice, it's the choice.
As we had Italy in 1990, France 98.
Different culturally, linguistically, food.
Do you want me? Are you going to ask me which one's better? Because I think you know the answer to that one.
but in a serious point, this is the global tournament, and the idea that in Asia you've gone from those two places, considering all the other cultures and locations that could host a tournament like.
I think it's a fair point. I'm not going to disagree with your point that it's a fair point. It's in the same region, but the reality is, just because it's in the same region and just because culturally they're the same. Now, I'm not saying that, because I'm sure if I asked a Saudi and a Qatari that your culture is the same, I'm not sure I would get that answer. Yeah, right. So I don't know that, but the reality is that doesn't disqualify Saudi Arabia from bidding for a World Cup just because Qatar had it in 2022. And by the way, this World Cup would be 12 years after the fact. So it's not the next one, and it's not the one after that, because it's obviously in North America, then Europe, and then it needs to come back somewhere. So it shouldn't disqualify them just because Qatar hosted in 2022. I think your point is valid in the sense of that region is a vibrant region. We saw what Australia has done with the Women's World Cup. There's huge football fans in that region, as we know. But having said that, I think Saudi Arabia has every right to bid for the 34 World Cup, just like anybody else does in that region.
If you follow the FIFA rotation rules, then 2038 it's between CONCACAF and Oceania. So you need to start getting your bid work done there, Victor. But I was actually going to say 2027 World Cup. US, Mexico are going for that. If that's unsuccessful, do you anticipate they'll go for 2031? Because we've also heard that Saudi may go for the 2035 Women's World Cup.
That's news to me. In terms of the US-Mexico bid, yeah, they put an intent to bid. We'll know at the end of the year. I think the deadline is the end of the year to actually submit your bid. I think they're probably, as my two federations are probably going through their due diligence, both in terms of the technical side of the bid and probably the political side of the bid. And, listen, there are countries that will not have any difficulty hosting the Women's World Cup from a infrastructure standpoint. So if they're going to go forward for 27 or not, obviously they'll decide. But I think they would definitely be ready to host for the next one for sure, because I don't think hosting it would be a challenge in terms of the infrastructure, and then obviously, building on 26 is a huge platform for them as well from a bidding standpoint. So yeah, if it's not 27, then it definitely will be 31.
And we've got through all this conversation on mentioning VAR, which perhaps someone would actually want us to press you on, but perhaps it's a relief not to. Well, it's been great you could join us here. One final thought. So really, inside FIFA, what do they think about everything we're doing, all the media are doing when we're asking questions of FIFA?
Listen, you're asking Victor here now, so I can't speak for FIFA. Although I think, listen, it's a reality of our business, and I think from our perspective, I think with all due respect, our sport wouldn't be our sport if it wasn't for the players. It's all about the players. Let's be honest. They're not watching me or you, speak. All right, as much as hopefully we have many listeners on this podcast. But the truth of the matter is that we're an industry, and I think we sometimes forget that. And our industry is important, and everybody in the industry is important. Players, coaches, the technical side, but the people that take the tickets, the people that sell the hot dog, the people that govern the game, like myself, but also the media. I think it's a massive important, and I think it's also important for the media to be responsible in doing it the right way. Yes, asking the hard questions, but also, but also reporting that in the right way. Like any industry, you have the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I think overall, I think I can't really say anything in terms of the media, the mainstream media, they're doing the right thing. Obviously, you always have some people that are offside in terms of personalizing things and maybe being a bit slanderous in terms of how they say things. But listen, I think for the most part, my experience with you lot has been fantastic. I have had absolutely no complaints about how I'm treated, and it's always been fair. And, and I hope that, every time you've asked me something, I've been pretty clear and transparent in terms of my answers.
Perhaps we should rename the podcast The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I volunteer to be the ugly.
Well, Tariq had his hand up first, actually. So there's two uglies. So that leaves me and you, mate.
Yeah, we're there. Well, Victor, great you could join us here. Victor Montagliani, the CONCACAF President, FIFA Vice President, joining us on Sport Unlocked. Quite a few notable things happened on stage at Leaders in Sport. We had the FA Chief Executive Mark Bullingham apologising for the hurt and distress caused to the Jewish community over not lighting the arch in Israeli colours. We had A22, the Super League company, given a big presence on stage despite questions over just how valid any of their plans are at all. And what caught your eye?
Yeah, we also had Saudi, but that didn't catch my eye. What caught my eye was there was a session with Steve Parish, the Crystal Palace co-owner and chairman, and specifically what he was saying about professional women's football and the women's game in England, I suppose. And we've talked about this idea that just mapping women's football onto men's football, which has been around for 100 years and just doing the same thing risks the same problems. And Parish said something really interesting. Martyn, you were there as well, and he was talking about this risk of having just two or three teams right at the top, spending huge amounts of money and creating a gulf and a lack of competitive balance. I think he said last season in the WSL, there was 160 goals difference for the top four teams, and that meant the rest were 160 goals down. Martyn, do you want to unpack a bit more of what he said?
Yeah, so I think he was pointing out the fact there's no salary cap, there's no cost controls in the Women's Super League. So you basically have this sort of complete free market, and then if you are a big club, it's quite easy to get good profile by spending a bit of money, but you get this sort of the haves and have-nots, very, very stark divisions in women's football in this Women's Super League at the moment, and it's too predictable is what the point he was making.
At a time, he said, when they're trying to grow the game, it's not an established 30, 40-year league with 50,000 fans every week. They're trying to grow interest. And if you're one of the have-nots and your fans know you're going to lose 6-0 and you're trying to start this competition, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, and we also heard from A22's Bernd Rijkaard, who was bemoaning now the Champions League is without Wolfsburg and Arsenal because they've been knocked out, and how almost advocating their Super League plan would be far better. Now, yes, Arsenal have been delivering big crowds at the Emirates Stadium in the Women's Champions League. Wolfsburg are a successful team, and you'd really miss their fan bases in this current competition. But it overlooks the achievement of Paris FC in knocking out both Arsenal, then Wolfsburg before the group stage. So supporting the achievements of a club that isn't at the very top in elite and showing there is hope.
Just to speak up for Paris FC for a sec, having visited them last year, they are one of the biggest spenders in women's football in French women's football. The men's team is in the second division, but talking to the owner last year, he did have one of the better budgets. Obviously, not a PSG Qatar fueled budget, but they're building a good women's program there at Paris FC, and all power to them.
Yeah, that challenge over encouraging investment, ensuring players are paid more, while ensuring there's still a competitive balance too. Well, that about brings an end to this week's episode of Sport and Lots. Obviously, so much politics, geopolitics to get into, and how football deals with those situations. As ever, you can message us at Sport and Lots on X, Facebook, Instagram, email sportandlotpod@gmail.com if you've got any thoughts. But for now, thank you for listening.